I never imagined my life would split so cleanly into before and after. But looking back now, the signs were there, quiet and deliberate. I was married into comfort, not passion. My husband was kind in a practiced way, attentive when it was convenient, distant when it mattered most. We lived together like partners managing a routine, not lovers sharing a pulse. I told myself that stability was enough, that wanting more was childish. That lie kept me calm for a long time. Then there was her. She entered my life as someone I was supposed to trust without question. She smiled easily, spoke softly, and listened in a way that made people feel seen. When she was around, conversations flowed better. Laughter lingered longer. I didn't feel threatened at first. I felt relieved. It was nice having someone else fill the silence my husband and I had stopped noticing. What I didn't understand then was that silence had been an invitation. Small things began to shift. Glances lasted a second too long. Messages were deleted by accident. Plans were made without including me, then explained away with excuses that sounded rehearsed. I noticed how they shared private jokes I wasn't part of, how their energy changed when I entered the room. I asked myself if I was imagining it, if insecurity was making me paranoid. I chose denial because it was easier than confrontation. One evening, a moment cracked that illusion. Nothing dramatic, no raised voices or confessions. Just a look they exchanged when they thought I wasn't watching. It wasn't guilt I saw. It was certainty. That was the night I understood this wasn't impulsive or accidental. Whatever was happening had intention behind it. They weren't stumbling into betrayal. They were walking toward it together. That I felt foolish for not seeing it sooner. But more than that, I felt strangely calm. There was pain, yes, sharp and heavy, but also clarity. For the first time in years, I stopped blaming myself for the emptiness in my marriage. I realized I hadn't failed to keep his attention. He had already chosen to give it elsewhere. And she hadn't taken anything that was truly mine. What they were planning only exposed what was already broken. I watched more carefully after that. I listened without reacting. I learned how deep it went, how long they had been testing boundaries, convincing themselves it was harmless. They thought they were clever. They thought I was unaware. What they didn't know was that with every secret shared between them, something inside me was waking up. I began to imagine a life beyond the one I was clinging to. Not revenge, not drama, just freedom. The idea scared me, but it also gave me strength. I stopped trying to fix what didn't want to be fixed. I stopped begging for attention that was already promised elsewhere. Instead, I observed, waited, and prepared myself emotionally for the truth I knew would surface. When everything finally came out, it wouldn't be a shock to me. It would be confirmation. And as strange as it sounds, part of me was grateful. Grateful that they planned it so carefully, because their certainty forced me to confront my own. That night, as I lay awake beside a man who no longer felt like mine, I realized this betrayal might not destroy me. It might be the reason I finally choose myself. Once I accepted that something was unfolding without my consent, I started noticing patterns instead of moments. Their behavior wasn't careless anymore. It was calculated. Conversations would stop the second I entered the room, then resume later with forced casualness. Plans changed last minute. Errands took longer than they should have. I wasn't being pushed out aggressively, just slowly edged aside, like someone hoping I wouldn't notice the space growing between us. What unsettled me most wasn't what they were doing, but how comfortable they were doing it. There was no panic in their voices, no urgency to hide. It felt rehearsed, like they had already discussed how far they could go without crossing a line that would force accountability. My husband became gentler with me, almost considerate in a way he hadn't been in years. Compliments appeared out of nowhere. Random concern. At first I thought guilt had finally found him. Then I realized it was strategy. Kindness used as cover is far colder than neglect. She played her role perfectly. Always supportive, always understanding, always careful to position herself as harmless. She confided in me about her own doubts, her own confusion, as if we were allies navigating something difficult together. The irony of it was almost impressive. She never spoke badly about him, never hinted directly at her feelings, but everything she said was designed to make me question my place. She asked gentle questions that planted sharp thoughts. Was I happy? Did I feel fulfilled? Did I think people could love more than one person at once? None of it sounded like manipulation in the moment. It sounded like concern. The realization came slowly, then all at once. I was sitting across from them, watching them speak to each other instead of to me. Their words were innocent, but the timing wasn't. The pauses weren't. They were communicating without language, confirming things silently. That was when it hit me. They weren't waiting to see what would happen. They had already decided. What they were doing now was managing the outcome. That I felt anger rise, hot and immediate, but it didn't explode. It settled. I understood then that confronting them too early would only give them control of the narrative. They would frame it as confusion, as something that just happened. I refused to give them that comfort. If this was planned, then I would plan too. Not to hurt them, but to protect myself. I tested my assumptions quietly. I stepped back emotionally and watched how quickly they leaned into each other when I did. The closeness intensified the moment I stopped trying. That was proof enough. You don't replace something that's still there, unless you were already ready to let it go. Every boundary they crossed confirmed what I already knew. What surprised me most was my own response. I wasn't desperate to stop it. I wasn't fighting to reclaim what I was losing. Instead, I felt myself detach piece by piece. The jealousy faded and was replaced by something steadier. Acceptance. I began to see my marriage not as something being stolen, but as something being revealed for what it truly was. Empty promises don't shatter when they break. They simply collapse. There were moments when they looked at me, maybe wondering if I knew. I let my face stay calm. Silence became my advantage. They assumed my stillness meant ignorance, maybe even weakness. In reality, it meant clarity. I was no longer reacting to them. I was watching them expose themselves. By the time they believed they were ready to take the next step, I had already made peace with what was coming. They thought they were orchestrating a quiet betrayal. What they didn't realize was that in doing so, they gave me something I hadn't had in years: the certainty that staying would be the real mistake. The moment everything shifted wasn't loud or dramatic. It didn't arrive with accusations or tears. It came quietly, in a conversation that wasn't meant to reveal anything but ended up confirming everything. We were sitting together, the three of us, and the air felt heavier than usual. There was an ease between them that no longer bothered to hide. They spoke openly, confidently, as if they had already rehearsed what this new dynamic would feel like. That was when I realized they weren't afraid of losing me. They were counting on me understanding. My husband spoke about honesty, about how people change, about how relationships aren't meant to stay the same forever. He didn't say her name in the way you would expect, but he didn't have to. Every word leaned in her direction. She watched me carefully, not with guilt, but with anticipation. She wanted to know how I would respond. Would I break? Would I fight? Would I beg? I gave them none of that. I listened. I let them speak without interruption. Inside, something strange happened. The hurt was there, undeniable, but it no longer controlled me. Instead, there was a sense of relief I hadn't anticipated. Hearing them articulate what I had already felt lifted a weight I didn't realize I'd been carrying. I wasn't wrong. I wasn't imagining things. I wasn't asking for too much. I had simply been holding on to something that had already let go of me. They expected anger. They expected resistance. What unsettled them was my calm. I told them I had known for a while. Not the details, not the conversations, but the truth of it. I explained that distance doesn't appear overnight, and intention doesn't grow without permission. I didn't accuse. I didn't insult. I spoke plainly, honestly, and without apology. That honesty shifted the balance. For the first time, they weren't in control of the situation anymore. She tried to soften it, to explain that nothing was meant to hurt me, that feelings just developed. I stopped her gently. Feelings don't plan, I said, but actions do. Silence followed. In that silence, I felt something I hadn't felt in years: power. Not over them, but over myself. I wasn't there to negotiate my worth or compete for attention that had already been redirected. What surprised them most was when I admitted I was glad it happened. Not because betrayal is painless, but because living in uncertainty had been worse. Their plan forced clarity where comfort had kept me stagnant. I told them that love shouldn't require me to shrink, to question my intuition, or to accept half-truths just to keep the peace. If this was the path they had chosen, then I would choose mine without regret. The conversation ended without resolution, but I didn't need one. I had already resolved what mattered. That night, I packed a small bag, not in anger but in certainty. There were no slammed doors, no dramatic exits. Just a quiet decision made with a steady heart. I walked away from a life that no longer fit, not because I was pushed out, but because I finally allowed myself to leave. Later, alone with my thoughts, the sadness came in waves. I let it. Healing doesn't come from pretending you're unaffected. But beneath the grief was something stronger. Freedom. The kind that comes when you stop fighting for a place where you were never meant to stay. They had planned their future together carefully. In doing so, they unknowingly gave me permission to plan mine, and for the first time it was built entirely around me. Time has a way of softening sharp edges without erasing the truth that caused them. In the weeks that followed, I expected to feel empty, lost, or defeated. Instead, I felt quiet. The chaos I had been bracing for never arrived. What replaced it was space. Emotional space I hadn't realized I was desperate for. Without constantly questioning intentions or reading between lines, my thoughts finally belonged to me again. I didn't cut them off immediately. There were practical things to resolve, conversations that couldn't be avoided. But the dynamic had changed completely. They spoke to me with a kind of careful respect, as if unsure of their footing. Whatever power they thought they had gained by planning their betrayal dissolved the moment I stopped reacting to it. I wasn't angry anymore. I wasn't pleading for explanations. I was simply done. That unsettled them more than any confrontation ever could. What surprised me most was how quickly I began to recognize myself again. I slept better. I laughed without forcing it. I made decisions without asking permission or considering how they would land with someone who no longer prioritized me. The loneliness I feared never came. In its place was clarity. I understood now that love built on convenience and silence can survive for years, but it will never grow. What they had wasn't stolen from me. It was something I had already outgrown. There were moments of reflection where I questioned my own role. I didn't paint myself as a victim without flaws. I acknowledged where I had settled, where I had stayed quiet to keep things comfortable. That honesty didn't weaken me. It strengthened me. Accountability feels different when it's chosen instead of forced. I learned that betrayal doesn't always arrive to destroy you. Sometimes it arrives to wake you up. Eventually, news reached me that their plan hadn't unfolded as smoothly as they expected. Reality is less forgiving than imagination. Trust is fragile when it begins in secrecy. I felt no satisfaction in that knowledge, only confirmation. What starts in shadows rarely survives in daylight. Still, their outcome was no longer my concern. My healing didn't depend on their regret or success. It depended on my willingness to move forward without bitterness that I rebuilt slowly and intentionally. New routines. New boundaries. I learned to listen to discomfort instead of silencing it. I promised myself I would never again confuse consistency with love or loyalty with self-sacrifice. The experience didn't make me cynical. It made me discerning. I didn't close my heart. I protected it with wisdom instead of fear. Looking back now, I can say the words without hesitation. I'm glad it happened. Not because it didn't hurt, but because it ended something that no longer served me. They both planned for their future, believing I was an obstacle to manage. What they didn't realize was that in doing so, they cleared the path for mine. I didn't lose a marriage that day. I gained my voice, my direction, and a version of myself that no longer waits to be chosen.